So this passage starts with the Greek words biblos genésεως, which can be interpreted book of the beginning or book of genealogy. So what does it refer to? I will present 4 different suggestions. Some scholars suggest that number 1, it refers to the entire gospel, serving as the title for the whole book. That is, this is the book of beginning. Jesus, he is the new beginning. Something new is getting started. And this is kind of, as we have the Gospel of Matthew, the title would be the book of the beginning. Others would propose that it is just for the first section from 1:1 until 4:16, because after 4:16 then Jesus, he is fully introduced. We have learned about him, we have learned about the Baptist. Jesus has been sent out to the wilderness to be tempted and so on, but now in 4:17 it says, from that time on Jesus began to preach. So this suggestion number 2 is that the book of the beginning, it is from the start up until Jesus is fully introduced and he starts his ministry. The third view is that it specifically applies to the first 2 chapters, Matthew 1 and 2, how Jesus, his genealogy, but also his birth, his announcement, but how it happens with the magicians from the east and so on. Maybe it could be also just the first chapter, but then a different and the last and fourth perspective is that it refers only to Matthew 1 verse 1 to 17, the genealogy per se, all these names that kind of lead up to the person of Jesus. So what do we do with these 4 alternatives? Well, you can say that there are some literary connections between verse 1 and 17 and the following 18 to 25. So there are some literary relationships between them, also between chapter 1 and 2. Of course, we can also see that there are a specific section from here, the beginning, until 4:16, when Jesus is fully introduced. And we can also see that there are some connections, and you could argue well that there are connections between this and the entire gospel, because there are different themes that are introduced here. But it's quite interesting, I think, the last view, that this is only the genealogy, verse 1 to 17, because we will see that these verses, they form, we could say, a recognizable and independent unit by themselves. And we will see it in the next slide through the chiastic inclusio in verse 17. Now, what is a chiastic inclusio? A chiastic inclusio is a literary device that authors used to kind of show parts and a structure in a text, which says, here is the beginning and here is the end of this section. Follow me to the next slide. We start with something, A, talk about it, go to B, talk about B, and then to C, and we talk about C. And then what follows is the reverse. From C, we talk about B, but in a new way, and then we talk about A at last in a new way. So it's kind of, it's an arrow, you see. It goes in one way and it turns back in the other way. Now, I don't know if you have noticed this, but Matthew, he does it in a quite interesting way in these verses, in the beginning and the end of this pericope. How is it done? It's done like this. In verse 1, he says, in this order, Christ, and then David, and then Abraham. Then later on, when he has gone through the whole genealogical list, he summarizes, but now he does it from the other way. He starts with Abraham, goes to David, and reaches Christ. Now this is a chiastic structure which shows us that even though this text is part of a larger text, this part is a unit by themselves. There is a start and there is an end to it. Now it doesn't mean that there aren't connections to the following units, but this is a unit by itself. Matthew uses the structure of 3 groups of 14 names, and this holds, of course, significance. Significance that we have very much problems as new readers to understand and also appreciate, you know. But likely there is more than just easy pedagogical purposes. Matthew, he deliberately arranged these with some notable omissions. If you would go through all this list, you will see that, well, there are some names. There must have been more than these 3 times 14 names in order for the time to just work up. So there are some omissions. He skips out of some names so that he make it 3 lists of 14 names. And these actually, if you would look into it, they represent an unequal historical period of time. The first period would be 750 years, about more or less, you know. The second, 400 years, and the third about 600 years. So there is something going on. And Matthew, he's doing something to show us how Jesus is the climax in some way. And we will investigate in what way. What is the purpose of these 3 times 14 generations? Interpreting the 3 sets as multiple 7s, you know, we have 6 7s. It signifies the imminent entrance into the 7th period, a period denoting perfection and fulfillment with the coming of Christ. You see, if we have here 14 and 14 and 14, that makes 7 7 7 7 7 7 7, and then Jesus, when he now enters, he starts the 7th times 7th generation. There are some other alternative also. For example, there are 3 groups that might represent the 10th week of the year, akin to 1st Enoch 93 1 to 10. Also, another possible allusion is to Daniel's reference to the 70 weeks of the year, where reckoning a generation is about 35 years. The total reaches 490. Hence, following 3 periods of 70 weeks of the year, then God sends his Messiah into the world. These are 2 other alternatives. Now, some commentators, they note the numerical value of the Hebrew letters, spelling the name David, and that the numerical value of the Hebrew name David would be 14. So in Hebrew culture, each letter has its own numerical value. The first letter of the alphabet, Aleph, would be 1, Bet would be 2, and so on. And in the beginning, instead of using numbers to write, they use these letters to write also numbers. So, therefore, the 14 might be David. And so some commentators, they speculate that Matthew might have structured this old genealogy with David's importance in mind. how can we think about this? Well, to be honest, as Matthew's book is written in Greek, the numerology of the Hebrew name, it wouldn't be evident at all actually to a Greek readers without an explanation. So, I don't know. Also, the association of 14 with the moon cycles and the genealogy's turning point, Davidic kingdom, Babylonian exile, the appearance of Christ. It seems intriguing but coincidental also, as the genealogy does not apply a gradual waxing or waning of Israel's fortunes. So, what do we say about the true intent of the 3 times 14 structure? Well, until now, it remains inconclusive. The Vede notion of multiple sevens likely holds significance, but whether Matthew chose the 3 14s is due to the form of the genealogy list that he used, or might to a pivotal turn that points to first David's kingdom, which makes a pivotal turn in the story, and then bam, the Babylonian exile, which also makes a pivotal turn in the whole story. It's uncertain. What Matthew certainly seeks to convey is the providential design underpinning Israel's history, structured in more or less equal segments through, of course, not precisely equal, but more or less. This providential plan leads appropriately and in due course to the ultimate goal, which is the fulfilling and the promise of the coming Messiah. Now, this is the last part in this lesson with form and structure, and we will look and compare Matthew to Luke. Both of them have genealogies, Matthew in chapter 1 and Luke in chapter 3. So, in contrast to Matthew, Luke, he presents the genealogy in the reverse order, not from Abraham down to Jesus, but they start with Jesus and trace it back, but not just to Abraham, but all the way back to Adam, which he referred to as the Son of God then. So, between Abraham and Jesus, Luke includes 56 names, while Matthew's genealogy contains 41 names. Then the primary difference between the two genealogies lies in the line of the descent chosen. Luke follows the lineage of Jesus through David's son Nathan, while Matthew traces the royal lineage from David through Solomon. There are 2 main ways to explain the extensive difference between the two genealogies. So in the beginning, from Abraham and down to David, it's the same name and it's the same, but from David and down to Jesus, there are different names. If you would put Luke and Matthew together, and you compare them, you would see there are different lineages. Because from after David, Luke go through Nathan, and Matthew go through Solomon. And this, my friend, can be explained in these 2 following ways. The first possibility is that we most often think that it's Luke. He traces the ancestry of Mary, while the other genealogy traces Joseph's ancestry. So one of these goes through Mary and the other is Joseph. The other way to explain it is that both genealogies refer to Joseph, but one emphasizes the actual biological descent, while the other focuses on the legal descent, and see how they come together in a sense. But one from the biological nature, one from the legal nature. So the biological and the legal, where the royal line comes from, it comes from one and the same. So, considering Matthew's emphasis on the kingly line, the second explanation it appears to be the most plausible. An essential point to note is that we should not expect modern day precision in these genealogies, these ancient genealogies. You know, genealogies in the ancient times often contained omissions, variant spelling, and even variant names. Yes, individual could have multiple names, so there are genealogies with different names here and there, and genealogies could have been motivated by theological considerations. However, recognizing the theological interests of Matthew and the theological interest in Luke and their impact on these genealogies does not negate their factual nature. Both are dependent upon the facts and the truth. Both Matthew and Luke are concerned with representing the facts from their sources. Neither of them are fabricating lists. These genealogies, much like the content in the Gospels, should be understood as interpreted history, containing factual data presented, of course, with theological intentions.